Gigantium Mysteria. Chapter 1. The Mega Mansion was the first to build deep foundations, deep into the earth, as well as also constructing both wide and tall connecting buildings, above ground but also below. Not just the first to have the underground floors, but long stretched out tunnels that connected to outbuildings way beyond as well. It was also the first to push the boundaries deeper underground as well, going much further with their underlayering than had been done before, and to go so far. In contrast to the former dwellings, the mega mansion had appeared quite large, giant in fact, to that age, yet size of course was relative to the time that one was at, and where one was of course, not just the time, but also the place. Where one got to be once the biggest giant of the island, by far over the century, yet it had become overgrown long ago, with larger buildings growing up and growing out in many directions long ago. It would have been overshadowed long ago by the greater, grander, new emerging giant buildings of the last centuries. If it had been built in such a rocky, deserted, wilder place, much more remote, in a hard to get to, inhospitable part of the island of Gigantium, well, then it was only called that by the outsiders who rarely got to visit there. So it was called that by them. It was also known by its former name as well. The island itself wasn't just known as Gigantium, but Mysteria too. It had two different names, but officially Gigantium Mysteria was the fused name. Others had claimed that Enchantia was a name of its earlier times, but that was never officially recognised or accepted. In fact, the earliest locals had called it something else altogether, but that wasn't known and couldn't be pronounced or deciphered. Nevertheless, the post-colonial workforce, the first known human inhabitants who'd settled there, having to adapt to the influx of their new environmental refugees and tourists who'd decide to stay on, so its official name had really merged over time with an archaic name. It had always been the Mysterian Islands, because of the mysterious type of giant trees and a few of the giant animals with advanced abilities that they had studied, unknown before, and that they had grown up learning the mysteries of. It had always been known as Mysteria, and Gigantium Mysteria was more of its official name. Gigantium was what it had later morphed into. Well, there were various pronunciations and different ways of saying Gigantium Mysteria, or Gigantium Mysteria, but subtle variations of the same similar name. It was never called Enchantia, not by anyone around anymore. Even if it was ever once called that long ago, that was disputed. Many had grown up living and knowing the new name, though, the modern name, that the island had become known for. It obtained a lot of global prestige for the incredible size of the megastructures within it, that they were unified, merged and melted within themselves, and that many of the megastructures had begun unifying and melting with each other into great mega-alliances of many of the megastructures, in mega-conglomerations of megastructures too, what were later known as the mega-megastructures by others, the giants, as they were later then called, that made even the earlier giants seem like dwarves in comparison. Again, it was relative in size. But still, in its day, the actual mansion itself, the Mansioneras, Mega Mansion as it was called, it had such great prestige because it was the first of its earlier kind, with several million people that could live within its original design. It was a little cramped with it, but at a squash it was possible that it could hold up to several million people, although later adaptations and extensions allowed for the possibility of many more. Its megastructure was on an expansive island that was rich in minerals and nutrients already needed. deeper under the ground, under the deeper desert itself, and in the pockets of islands, the green oases that had sprouted up and still retained here and there, and in the central flux where the great river surged forth, the giant river cutting through the island in half, along the green valley, in Giant Valley as it was called, where sprouted up a few of the archaic giant trees that were still known and visited with great prestige itself. On the upper part, to the east of that part of the river, that's where mega mansions had first been built. On the slopes of some of the great mountains in the north part of the region. So it was the central northeastern part of the island of Gigantium itself. So it was about 100 or so miles from the giant river, and a longer way from the more central giant trees at the lower part section of the winding lower river that wound its way, going around different oases, creating more as the path spilled out further, either east or west sometimes. There were sprouting green pools and oases, flourishing with green foliage, fauna and flora were thick in abundance, with bushes, trees of all different sizes, abundant too in animals, but they were only limited to patches and areas that covered around 15% of the total landmass area, of the total surface area. Those were only the long green rivers and different entrails, branches that had stretched out on both sides, and branches off the branches too, and branches even off the branches of the branches, like a tree almost in the middle, to look about it from an aerial view overhead, with thick green branch stems that were long green corridors, winding streams and brooks that ran off the main central artery. It was a vast thing to perceive, an incredible thing to fly over and witness. On one half of the island that was actually quite rounded in its overall shape, and it was about 1,000 miles across from east to west, and as many from north to south as well. From coast to coast, from any opposing coast, there was a great expanse of those plunged deserts in most of the area, in vast great stretches of it too. It was also arid and rocky and dry in many of the places. That did allow for some grasslands to grow up to some extent, but had only a limited number of trees that could grow in the undernourished soils and sands that were much more rockier, drier. The grasslands and the few scrublands and all the more deserty areas took up 70 or 80% of the vast land of the island now, though. And scattered throughout most of those, what were on the western side, were thousands of small quarries, the 1,000 lakes as they later became, although they were known as the 1,000 pits for many a century. 1,000 giant holes, but all varying in different sizes, giant quarries sculpted out, vast terrains. They were large enough lakes when they were later filled in. They were later filled in with a lot of water that had been channeled in from the nearby sea on the western coasts. It became known as the giant lakes, the 1,000 lakes, or the 1,000 islands, as some people called it. Also known as the fish lakes, or the fish islands. It had many different names. The boating islands, too, was one of the other terms, and the diving islands, as it later became called, having many different dwellers and visitors that would be attracted towards the great islands, the great lakes, the 1,000 islands, on their many boating trips, fishing trips, swimming trips, and also just tourist leisure trips too. A few hundred of the visiting vast pools. They were larger lakes. They had grown and been sculpted out as much bigger, deeper, and wider. Some of them were even many miles wide, and also as many miles deep. Incredible. That had to need sub-divers to go that far to explorate. As deep as they were wide. Incredible. Miles and miles. People would visit them for deep sea diving or deep lake diving. And of course there were lots of boating that were allowed on some of them, with permits. Fishing could be allowed on those numbers where the fish thrived. Swimming was allowed in others of the lakes. It had evolved and been adapted into a great many uses. The giant 1,000 lakes. Before there had been 1,000 quarries, And there were still many hundreds that still had that purpose. Some were still functional mines that were working. Others were just tourist resorts. Some had archaeological, scientific researchers. And others were just more tourist resorts, places that people could visit for the small amounts of flora and fauna that had persisted and grown back in this large enclaves that grew on the terraced roofs, sculpted out in the inner circles around the edges of the actual pit and the giant quarries themselves. The large quarries were filled with many muddy pools for a long time, rainwater that had fallen over generations collected in there, those that hadn't filtered out or been filtered through the quarry itself. Others collected vast amounts of muddy water. Others were dirty or had still industrial traces of the factory remnants that had been left and not cleaned out, that lay deep in the actual skin, buried on the surface, or deep built within the foundations of the quarry itself, either within the sides of the quarry where they'd been sculpted out of, or they were laying strewn about, industrial machinery half finished, broken down, or the industrial factory remnants built inside the actual quarry itself, sometimes inside the mine itself. Very often there were fragments and parts of broken, worn down machinery that was left behind, those parts that hadn't been used and taken away. The most important parts, of course, had been foraged out, sculpted out, and been looted long ago. But there were larger industrial units melted into the actual surface itself, too difficult and complexly entwined and connected to the earth and to other vast, large, heavy ornaments, bolted down and too bulgy to remove by any. He would need a giant industrial machine to take away some of those larger implements that had been left there just to rust and just to slowly degrade. Some of them had been treated, of course. A great many had been. Some of them had been sealed over, and others simply had just been left behind to rot, to ruin, to rust up, and to pour out some of their industrial liquids. Some of those quarries, therefore, over the decades, had been sealed up, were out of bounds, for no divers, swimmers, visitors, certainly not any tourists, could visit. One had to have special licenses, special equipment training, special protective equipment even to visit those quarries, never mind to explore many of them. There were many different rules and regulations about how, when, and who was permitted to visit many of the outer-bound quarries, before a large number of them were filled in and turned into some of the great lakes. Others that could not be treated were still left, inhospitable, and never visited except by scientists with extreme precaution, with their safety suits, and with all the safety equipment needed. There have been many that have been filled in by the streamlined, channeled waters, channeled in from the great seas beyond, as the rocky, muddy pits had for many decades become a place where visitors still liked to go to. Many of them were still safe, those that had not been industrialised quarries, or ones that could have been treated and were done. Even when the forbidden places, because of those risks, had lured many into the giant quarried out holes, to make their descent, to explore, or just to have a new curious experience, down into the former minor paths, those that had not been washed apart and washed down by the muddy slides, still accessible to many tourists, and still many investigators also. But still there were many more later landslides and muddy slides too, paths that were treacherous, that were inhospitable, that were difficult, that had narrowed down over the years, that were slippy, sloping, sloppy paths. There were many accidents and incidents, and therefore many path closures, and only parts of the quarries that could be visited, lower parts that were inobtainable, inaccessible, or that had to be only gone down through a certain ladder, or that one had to carry along with one. Difficult things to have for many people. Some people were able to abseil down, professional abseilers and professional ladderers that had the right equipment, those that were specialised and able to, and also had a good reason. Usually they were there to study, historians, archaeologists, geologists, even a few biologists that were hoping to find some animals perhaps that had gone there to retreat and to look for somewhere to live far from the humans. There were many there that went for their industrial studies, and that had all the right equipment to explore those particular collapsed-in quarries, the inhospitable muddy quarries as they were. Many were only part, and a great many were just part accessible. But still, many chanced and decided to try out many of the muddy, sloping pathways. In those muddier quarries, it was difficult to know how some of the pathways might be, whether they would still support the weight of many passing people. Some of them were narrow and seemed fairly okay in dry weather, if one was cautious. But every now and again, some of them would give way, and even the dry mud could collapse and crumble if too much weight was put upon it, if it was somehow pushed, or if something just gave way suddenly, and it could happen sometimes. So for that reason, even many of those that seemed relatively safe perhaps for a time were still out of bounds as an extreme precaution. Because there still were the occasional mudslides and many accidents, medical people were tired of being called out to the old quarries and of having to address injuries. It was very difficult for the medics themselves to be lowered down within with all their equipment to get those that had fallen deep within out. So therefore it became out of bounds, and many medics refused to go to the deeper parts of the quarries themselves, because it was so difficult for the hospital helicopters to get there and hover overhead and to lower the right equipment, and also the paramedics themselves, who needed all sorts of other additional equipment too, as well as training, as such specialist medics were in short supply also, to be called out so regularly to people having fun and just slipping around, creating all sorts of accidents, unnecessarily for themselves and others. Nevertheless, some of those that were relatively safer, that had only smaller collapses on higher levels, that were never that far to fall anyway, there were never those serious injuries that often. People still went there to those safer muddy places, muddy quarries to visit. If they took some precaution, they usually got away with minor injuries. It was very rare that anyone suffered anything really serious. Most of the paths were relatively quite rocky, and they were well trodden anyway, and other visiting ramblers and tourists that had some interest often put up some fencing occasionally, and people took extreme caution on some of the narrowed-in paths and some of the muddier paths too. Usually one could be alright if one took care, and the less muddy, patchy paths. They've become popular for many tourists, in fact, for sporting holidays even, for doing their various activities, abseiling, climbing, scrambling, adventuring. People even stopped there on the lower levels of the quarry just for picnicking with families, those that were still safer, still intact, hadn't been drained and muddied away too much, where people could still have vast areas to look down into the quarries themselves, to look down at lower levels, those were relatively safer for families, for friends, for lovers to visit, just to have romantic retreats together. People there went on just ecological tourism sometimes as well, for study field trips. Scientists went there to study the local fauna and flora that had grown up in that remote specific quarried location, as well as also attracting many other students of all different subjects too. The pits had attracted many different people, with many different reasons, and only a minority had really fallen down or had serious incidents down there, down the rocky, muddy, sloping, slipping, sloppy paths. Many were the skeletons that had been found deeper within those paths as well, the underpaths, the collapsed-in paths, in the lower parts, the deeper ravines of the quarries itself, in the holy lands as they were called. The land of many holes, as it was known for many centuries. Thousands of holes, giant holes, vast holes, muddy pits and pools of holes. Muddy pools, water holes, muddy pools of holes too. There were clean water holes as well as the dirty water holes as well. Holes of all sorts of different kinds, junk holes as well that you wouldn't want to go in, just that had become a place where people threw stuff in because it had already been dumped with lots of abandoned industrial equipment, and people had just added to it really, and it had slowly filled up. The trash holes were many, hundreds of those in one particularly unvisited corner of the region, one that no one really went to except to dump rubbish perhaps. It only made up a couple of % of the overall surface, a small, inhospitable region. It was in the lower south of the region, that it was a vast, remote, inhospitable place anyway, that gave little life, a very rocky desert area, that few animals could even live in anyway, except for bacteria and maybe some ancient species that were little known of. The hundreds of dumping holes, many vast, some even miles in length and size and depth, they were just the dumping holes. There were many hundreds of others that weren't meant to be dumping holes, but they were sometimes used as that, and lots of clean-up programs were engaged, and people were abseiled down to lower levels of the holes to clean out the deeper parts of those that had been designed and sculpted and adapted to become visitor holes, visiting quarries, educational quarries. There were even studied quarries as well, scientific experimental laboratory quarries as well, that had been built deep within a few of those, just a few dozen, that people lived within while they were studying quarry life and doing historical accounts, looking at those that had lived and survived, the animals that were thriving deeper within those caves, deep within the unknown quarries of that region. The study quarries were not often visited, those few hundred that there were. Most of those were closed and abandoned, 90% of those at least. They were too dangerous, treacherous, rocky, muddy sloping paths, collapsed in industrial areas that leaked and oozed, chemical industrial elements and agents from hundreds of years ago. Chemicals that one didn't understand what exactly they were, couldn't decipher what the words or symbols on the various instruments and machine objects were. So those were out of bounds, and after many scientists, explorers, and subjects had had all different symptoms that they'd experienced, dozens of those that had never been studied, therefore, and many dozens more of the deeper holes, the subject quarry holes, that never were really deeply investigated for those reasons. Of the hundreds that were studied relatively well to a varying extent, there was really only a dozen or so that were really open to the public. The industrial holes themselves were of little interest to the public anyway. The ancient industrial quarries, those were only occasionally visited by those interested in history of the quarrying industrial world, really. Those with a limited interest in those fields did visit occasionally, and those, of course, that were able to engage and adapt their own activity holidays as well, that had a curiosity to abseil, to climb, to also to just explore in so many different ways, mentally but also physically, to crawl, to climb, to scramble. Sometimes they even walked and rambled, sauntered sometimes when the weather allowed it, but often they were marching along, scrambling, climbing, abseiling, crawling, scrambling, clutching. Sometimes it will be caving, potholing. Sometimes it would be just crawling through small spaces, navigating the potholes. Lots of cavers and potholers too were attracted to the deeper ravines of it, those that could abseil down or be hoisted down themselves. There were those that were simply attracted not just because it was an activity place. There were lots of other abseiling quarries too, hundreds of those. The attractive leisure quarries, they facilitated most of the ordinary needs of the abseilers, quarriers, and also the climbing quarriers too. Most of the quarriers that enjoyed the climbing, abseiling, rambling, and walking activity holidays, most of them were going to the general population quarries, the popular quarries. There were about 300 or 400 of those, to be honest. There were probably only a few of the more old-fashioned, the more dangerous, the ancient quarries, the industrial or former industrial quarries. Only a few of them have really retained any real use, a tiny minority in fact. And some of those activity-driven people, those more curious to explore a more ancient activity, to go to quarry and to go to pothole, mine, dive, to climb, abseil, and also to explore for many reasons. Only very few of them went to those more dangerous, post-industrial ancient quarries, because they really didn't see a great need to it, although their scenery was often fantastic, involved ancient animals or artwork, or just great giant rock formations, parts of megalithic structures unknown, strange, that were of a former age, of an unknown, mysterious age, but covered around with this thick green foliage that was all too recognisable, in part. but also contained other, more remote, unknown species too. And that you could bring different stage props to as well. And so it made great visual, scenoramic, visual dramas as a scenoramic backdrop to the actual filmed recordings that many were lured in to perform. Because you didn't have to create some artificial, incredible visual world, because it was already there in wait. Something that was too fantastic, fantastic fauna and flora, exotic in some of the more remote quarries that had really grown up and existed in those places, together with the ancient quarried industrial remnants still littered in the deeper parts of the ancient quarries. Those made interesting visual backdrops as well as sometimes, on rare occasions, making interesting noises too, and sounds, though the smells, of course, weren't recorded themselves. But they were all still alluring. So the thousand quarries themselves had a great allurement, not just for entertainment and educational purposes too, but for activities, for physically exploring the different geological remnants and the different geological quarried worlds, the geological underworlds, as they were called, the great thousand islands of holes, the great thousand underworlds, as they were known, the great thousand lakes they would only later become in many centuries later. We learn in the Great Lakes about the history of those great thousand pits, as they were called from one people, the thousand quarries, as the others had called them, the thousand holes, and the holy lands, as they were known to the third group who'd settled there, and the thousand mysteries, as the Mysterians themselves had termed them. But whatever terms they went by, we knew them as the Thousand Lakes, as they had all long ago been filled in, covered up, buried over, or turned into great lakes themselves. Or they were out of bounds to visit for only research purposes, or those that were qualified to do specific educational studies that had a good educational reason to determine their risk of going out there. The Thousand Islands, as they were often called, as a colloquial term by all of the 5 different groups that had settled, merged, and melted into the Great Laking communities, as they were often now known. There were the 1,000 scattered islands that were mostly Great Lakes, the 1,000 lakes, though there were many hundreds that were no longer actually lakes that had dried out some time ago, or that had never really been lakes at all, actually, never really been filled in, because there was no need to. They were too dangerous, it wasn't seen as right to, they were too muddy, they had not been treated, or there were just unknowns there that were seen as too risky because of the sheer amount of incidents, accidents, or unknown things that were regularly reported in the ancient histories. For whatever reason, those that had been out of bounds, or just unswimmable, that had never been used or qualified to become a lake itself. But those were the minority of the thousands, perhaps 200 or 300. 1,000 at least had been filled in to a varying extent, creating the fishing, the boating, the diving, the swimming, and just the leisure lakes too, as I had visited on many occasions. The great leisure lakes that made up perhaps a quarter of those, of 230 of the lakes themselves, although some of them overlapped and were both leisurely and also official professional swimming lakes too. Some of those were leisurely and also had some boating on them too. There was a little overlap where some leisurely dived, but the professional divers, of course, only went to the real diving lakes, the ones that only the professionals could really obtain and were qualified to reach. The great leisurely lakes had, of course, many great megastructure leisure facilities dotted and all around them. Those were just the leisure lakes, of course. The educational lakes, or the exploration lakes as they were known to the divers, those were a very different kind of place in a very different geological part of the region, and were out of bounds for most of the public, those that weren't qualified or able or need or wanted to do it themselves. But they still had a lot of water within them, as the boating lakes had done as well, of course, and the fishing lakes as well as the diving and swimming lakes too. All of those collectively made up the 1,000 lakes, the Great Lakes, that had once been part of the 1,000 holes in the Holy Lands, or the quarried lands, as the others had known them. They had gone by many different varying names. It was the quarried lands, of course, to the quarried people, the holy lands to the holy people, those that had made the holes. The quarried lands were those that had quarried out the holes themselves, sculpted them out, that had adapted them. And then, of course, there were those later that had built it onto the lands themselves, the megastructurers themselves, the megalopians themselves, those that had built on the lands, those that had constructed out of and of the lands themselves, those that had come later, the Mysterians. They had become different themselves, and knew as the quarriers and the holers, and of course they also knew the megastructurers as earlier inhabitants, part and connected to their own origin themselves, yet a different tribe who'd melted and fused with them over the many years to make the great holes, the great quarries, into the great lakes as they now were, the great 1,000 lakes as they were known. Of course, there still were the 200 or 300 other lakes or other holes, and many more of the other holes still were not lakes in any real way, even if perhaps about 100 of those had occasionally been filled in with water. They collected sometimes years or decades of rainwater, those that hadn't been covered over enough over the years. But about 200 or 300 of those so far had been covered over in part or entirely, in fact. About roughly 200 of those were entirely covered over now. And those ones could be studied or sealed off, or could be ventured into by professional divers, professional explorers, by the professional geologists, or various others that needed and had to go and study within those. Those were the geologies of the Great Lakes within that region of the island of Gigantia. It was a difficult place to know and to live and to visit because there were so many of the different quarries, the different holes, the different lakes, and of the different regions that they all existed within. Many were the divers that had filmed the lake diving in the aquatic films that had emerged, with the underwater dramas, even underwater dancing that had taken place. It was great to see the underwater scenery, with the underwater forests swaying around them, the underwater flora and fauna of all different kinds, with the underwater synchronized schools of fishes that would swim around them. Of course, there weren't so many of the aquatic films with aquatic larger fish, not aquatic sharks, certainly. And there were also many scientific explorations into those aquatic forests, in the aquatic quarried out lakes that was swaying. The aquatic forests themselves were often seen as swaying around, moving as the currents were swayed by the boats that had swayed them. Then the former industrial factories that lay sunken, that stood underwater, like sunken shipwrecks, a ghostly reminder of the former worlds, of those ancient industrial worlds, now in the former industrial age, reminding them of that former world of their ancient people from a more distant time, of the world of man, who'd constructed the earliest megastructures before their time, who'd dug out the mega huts. And from an aerial space of view, from above, from one of the ancient satellites that had been passing overhead, it looked like one of the giant hands. A giant hand of a giant creature had poked with his finger 1,000 little holes into the desert, dotting them here and there, but in great number and clusters in lots of different regions. Dozens and dozens in one area, pushing his fingers and pushing further and more in some regions, and then dotting randomly other holes in other places, sporadically. The truly mega giant holes that he seemed to punch in with a giant fist, making a vaster hole that were the size of 3 or 4 of the holes of the earlier kind, and sometimes a dozen finger-sized holes as well. A giant fisted hole from above, it seemed. A vast giant circle, or sometimes a weird shaped. It was often difficult to describe the different shapes that they appeared as from above. But some of those giant-shaped quarried-out circles, the giant holes, were vast in their size, many miles in diameter from one side to the other, and many different amounts of size because they varied in their shape and size. Almost as if a giant had grabbed a handful of the desert out whilst creating a vast whole. With its mega stronghold iron hand, perhaps. The mega giant holes were really just colossal, giant, empty ravines. They were often going many miles deep inside the earth, and many, many wide as well, with many of the former paths that had run around the inside of the holes, that had many times often crumbled away. They were now often underwater, of course, and under only a few, because many of those had been taken away because not needed. Some were used for the underwater scuba divers or the underwater submarines that were now stationed low below. And a remnant was still left, and are still being used occasionally. Others were just left there to cover over with green algae, barnacles, and seashells that grew up on there too, and all manner of aquatic plant life too, that hosted themselves growing out of the old world steppes that were lining the inner walls of the under quarries, deep below under the water lurking. Still many had been chiselled and taken out as the quarry had been refined and shaped to create the lake or the pool or the leisure lake itself, the swimming pool, the fishing or boating lake, the diving lake. Many were left behind and were left there, though, to green over with the algae forests, or were used for the submarine divers still sometimes themselves. A part of their diving routines, they go down there, and at least they were still intact of them. They were used often for the underwater films. It was easy to go down, to have something to cling on to, and for the actual connections, so that you could hoist yourself in and off from the sides of the quarry, so that you had something for the machines to connect to as well, so that you didn't dangle off too far. So you could always have the oxygen containers hoisted in and weighted in and contained at the side. It was an incredible thing that had happened, but only a remnant of those now still existed. Most of those had been taken away and reshaped, resculpted as the new laking needs had been adapted. Many of those had been dried out quarries. The dried quarries never filled in, though, some of them. You could still see and follow the old miners' paths on those that had not been fully filled in, those that had not been converted into the lakes. You could still follow down some of the old miners' paths, follow the old tracks down to the mining machines, those that were left up, followed the paths that the old mining machines had rolled up and down themselves. It was rumoured by many that the secrets of the original Mysterians themselves could actually lay down there, hidden deep within the many of the collapsed-in paths or the filled-in quarries. Oh, there were many lurking conspiracy theories, popular in some parts of it, Emporium, and also some parts of the Geminites too, some of them who believed in those, even if many mansioneers had their skeptics and doubted those, as many other megastructures did too, as well as many other places. Those conspiracies were still unknown and still more remote in other parts of the Gigantium island. There were conspiracies that some things lurked deeper within those quarries, unknown mysteries that had been filled in, and that there were excuses made that the quarries were just too dangerous and out of bounds, and sealed off for those reasons, and that others had gone there quite okay sometimes and been okay a lot of the time, and that with precaution and training and with the right equipment it was possible to explore those areas still. But still, there was unknown amount of reasons why there was actually that concern, if there was anything genuine to base those suspicions of whether there was anything really there or not. There was no hard evidence to prove absolutely that there was anything mysterious, unknown, anything useful or beneficial lurking deep within there. There was no real reason to justify or to benefit taking such risks anyway, for most people. No real evidence credible had really been provided or existed. But still there was a great curiosity, a great speculation, and still most people didn't know it was possible, hypothetically, that some mysterious artifact, something unknown, of potential use or value, potentially could be down there, and it could have been even sealed over, buried over, covered over, for good reasons, and perhaps even unknown, unwittingly. Perhaps it was something of great use, some artifact anciently, or something of a great use and purpose in the future that had unwittingly, accidentally, unknowingly been sealed over just because they didn't know, those that were out of concern for others covering it over, because it was a dangerous place to get to, and because there were risks for others and members of the public, that they unwittingly had covered over things that could have been of great use to the public, because they had not known the use of the artifacts buried so deeply within, that had been unfound, that had been in places that had been long ago collapsed in, caverns caved in on and collapsed in, where artifacts of great use and purpose could hypothetically have been left there abandoned, unknown, by those that would later seal it off for safety reasons, out of concern for the public. Because also they didn't know, perhaps, if there were things of great use in those ancient mines. There was great speculation and uncertainty, but there were those that thought that they had some sort of evidence, that they felt that they'd retrieved some great ancient artifact from a deep unknown quarry in a remote location, but there were various disputes about what it was, and that it could well just be some fragment of some broken machine that had real no purpose in the modern world anyway, or some ancient mythological animal that was just an imaginative animal in a picture and a story that didn't really exist, that was just fictional and not hypothetical as a reality, and not a genuine, accurate portrayal that was left behind of the people that lived in that place and time. There were many speculations about what was in those quarries, but a real lack of credible evidence that could be proven beyond any doubt whatsoever. Even if there were artifacts that allegedly had been retrieved there, and even when they proved it did come from a deeper quarry, one of the ancient deeper quarries, still, even when they proved that it did come from there, with the live stream recording from there, with credible trusted sources that were broadcasted to members of the public from a variety of different megastructures, that were broadcast to a variety of different megastructures, even then, when it was proven that it was an ancient artifact, it was often disputed what it was, or if it was any real use at all, and it wasn't just a mildly curious historical artifact that was of no real use to a modern people, that had long ago advanced, changed, and adapted all their behaviours, their needs, and the climate and everything had adapted and changed long ago since then. Even those few fragments were just not accepted as something valid to look for much more, even though it was accepted that it was curious sometimes, and perhaps even credible, historical, and genuine up to a point, although there were a large number of other claimed ancient artifacts that were not really accepted. Either their legitimacy of what they were was not accepted, or that they were found at all from that place, from an ancient quarry, was not accepted. Nevertheless, there were lots of contentious, allegedly ancient artifacts that were surveyed, but no absolute evidence of what they were, of when they were found, how they were found, and what their real purpose was, and whether that was really useful. No evidence beyond all absolute doubt, therefore, and lots of speculation abounded. But it was of little interest and purpose for a great many people to go to such a far-flung, remote, difficult to get to, challenging, deep, unknown quarry, with unknown risks and unknown benefits deep within it. It was rumoured by many that the secrets of who the original Mysterians could actually be could have been deeply hidden within one of those deeper quarries, the ancient quarries, perhaps. Yes, a popular conspiracy theory in some of the Emporium's colossal megastructures. A few of them have become more widespread, even in parts of Emporia itself, and that had spread to other parts of the eastern provinces of Gigantia. Many dozens of those different megastructures, the different worlds themselves, they had become affected and adapted to their own strain of the conspiracy theories themselves. They had had a whole variety of lots of different beliefs about the alleged ancient Mysterian artifacts themselves, of whether they were real, or whether they were true and authentic, of where and when they were found as well. Yet there were many other parts, realms of Gigantia, whole stretches of regions, where those evidences were known of, like in mega mansion eras in the far north, where the Geminites knew of them well and had studied them also to some extent, but it was just not a great thing for them, not a big deal, not something of a huge interest, because their mountainous subsistence made that they were focused more on their own climatic needs, rather than ancient interests that could seem of little interest or relevancy to them anyway, and had lured them in only a little, not greatly. Neither had the mansioneers been lured in to any great extent either, both only taking a casual interest. And other megastructures of the north and regions too had mild and casual liberal interests in it that had been growing a little over the centuries, but still hadn't grown to any great extent though. In other regions, in other megastructures grew up, town worlds had grown up where that had taken a great stronger interest in the deeper unknown quarries and sent more tourists and explorers deeper to try and find ancient artifacts. And those had a greater number of disputed ancient artifacts, catalogues of those that were in dispute. Lesser of those were known in the northern inhospitable regions, both of the Geminites in their great megastructural towers, but also for the great mega mansioneers as well, in their mega mansions. And many of the other mega mansions, they were unknown. They knew nothing about the ancient alleged artifacts themselves. Many of the megastructures, the dotted islands of mega buildings, they just knew so little about any of the alleged ancient artifacts, knew nothing about that, so very little, it never was a great interest to study it. Never were there any great studies done, or no studiers were sent. No extrapolators, no investigators, divers, scientists, none were sent out whatsoever from a great vast number of the megalithic islands. Many of the megalithic worlds, the different islands of the fused megastructures, never sent any explorers out whatsoever, so were totally reliant on outsiders for their information. And that entirely depended on what their different alliances, their relationships were with the different megalithic worlds that existed. Their own cluster of alliance, their cluster alliance of megastructures, was really what shaped their own view of those ancient artifacts and of their view of the Gigantium ideologies anyway. Those that lived, the megastructures of the Western worlds, they often were more independent or more reliant on their own mega alliances, on the clusters of megastructures, on those mega worlds that they lived nearby, that they fused with to some extent, but only melted with in part. To some varying extent that could shift and change. They could be 30% fused with some local alleged partner, and then only 60% fused with another megastructuring world. A cluster of megastructure worlds that could be fused to different extents within their megastructure alliance, that made one shifting mega alliance within a different megastructuring wider alliance itself, an emporium as it was known as. But there was only real one giant emporium of Gigantium. That itself was really a giant megastructure that brought together lots of mega alliances of lots of mega worlds themselves. They were all vast mega structures that were fused and melted, giant mega towns themselves, each of many millions of people, either a few million or tens of millions sometimes. So that therefore the emporium, the great emporium that was the mega alliance of the mega alliances, of the mega structures that were the mega worlds, of course, that could have many hundreds of millions of people within it, since many of the megastructure alliances themselves could have many tens and tens of millions of people, 50 million in some, Megatron for example, and even in the Geminites they had 18 million themselves, albeit only 9 million in one of their megastructures, and in the other megastructure world they only had a roughly 12 million too. But still, each of the megastructures themselves could have many millions, or even 15 or 20 million. But the megastructure alliances themselves, they could have tens of millions, 20 million, in often cases there were several. Of course, the Geminites having 18 was pretty amazing. But the 50 million of some of the larger ones, some of them had 70 or 80 million, and that was just in the megastructure themselves, the mega world, one giant town, one giant megalopolis, as it was called by some. A megalopolis that could stretch and be vast, fused and melted into one giant building, with 50 or 60 million people within them. But most of the mega alliances were not megalopolises, though. They were groups of megastructures that housed within them 2 or 3 million people, the megatowns, the world towns as they were later called. Those world towns then were part of the mega alliances that had outstretched underbuildings, that had underbridges or overbuildings that connected the megastructures together, that they themselves could have 20, 30 or 40 million within them. But they were only often within the mega alliances. They were like the Emporium itself. But the Emporium itself was different because it itself housed different mega structures within mega structures. So that each of the mega structures that it overbridged or underbridged, that it itself was an alliance of, it bridged and connected and allied together lots of different alliances of megastructures. That was to say that each of its components was actually a megastructuring world, was a group of different megastructure that had already been fused. So that there could be 4 or 5 different megastructures that were all connected together with an underbridge and overbridge, or that were fused by long stretches of thin walls, walled buildings that they were, that connected different megastructure buildings, whether they were mega globes, megaspheres, mega pyramids, mega dodecahedrons, mega squares, whatever mega shapes they were. Those that were shaped independently, the different mega houses, the different mega structures, but that had different connections to each other, mega bridges that connected them, so that their different mega structures fused together through the mega bridges into a mega alliance. And the mega alliances, those then connected together, and that was what formed the Emporium itself. The Emporium itself was the connection of all of the different mega alliances. And the mega alliances themselves were the connection of all the different mega structures. But the first Emporium, it itself had gone to a more advanced level, because the mega structures themselves that were inside the Emporium were themselves Emporiums. So that there were a number of Emporiums that were then all connected by mega Emporiums. So the mega Emporiums all had giant mega Emporiums, giant mega emporial bridges, emporial tunnels. Sometimes they were giant emporial underbridges and giant emporium overbridges, but the giant emporiums were then all connected. So the Grand Emporium, as it was called, it itself was the only one of the island of Gigantium to really be called the Emporium for that reason. Because there were other Emporiums in the island of Gigantium, but it was the only real true Emporium, because within it, it had other overbridged or underbridged Emporiums within it. Those connecting Emporiums within the Grand Emporium, the Great Emporium, the True Emporium, as it was called, it had many Emporiums, overbridged or underbridged, connecting. The Emporium bridges were built between the different Emporium worlds, as they were known. So the Grand Emporium was really a world of worlds, and not really just a world itself in the island of Gigantium. Yes, there were many Emporiums who deserved and were worthy to be called that too. Yes, they too were megastructures connected by mega bridges, absolutely. And all the megastructures themselves were giant city towns, or sometimes they were giant worlds of town houses. They were city houses too sometimes. But the actual Emporium itself, There were many, many other emporiums, dozens of those on the island of Gigantium. But in actual fact, the Gigantium that was the emporium was only the official emporium because it was the emporium of emporiums. It was the emporium that had within it many other emporiums, and within the emporiums were all the megastructure connections, the megastructure bridges, the mega bridges that connected together the megastructures, the mega towns, the mega cities, and of course those mega towns themselves that had within them the mega houses. And that's what made it the mega worlds. That was the island of Gigantium's emporium of emporiums, as it was called. So emporium for short was only really the name. The emporium's colossal structure so didn't give justice to the name. Its official title really was the Emporium of Emporiums. That's what the giant vast city to outsiders was known as. Emporium of Emporiums. Megastructure of megastructures. With mega bridges of the mega bridges. And that's what it was known as in its official titles, though it was really only called the Emporium Worlds for short, because its title was really too long to pronounce and to say to others, to outsiders, outside of Mysteria.